We are taught that the rebel angels fell from heaven, cast down into the darkness of the earth, but ancient texts suggest they didn't just hide in the shadows. They wore crowns. What if the entity mainstream theology calls fallen angels are the exact same figures the ancient world worshipped as the old gods? The parallels are too precise to be a coincidence, from the grand deities of Egypt to the fearsome pantheons of Mesopotamia and across the ancient world, all share a terrifyingly similar blueprint. These entities weren't just banished spirits. They were built temples, offered sacrifices, and ruled as supreme powers, and evidence of their arrival is still carved in the stones of the ancient world. And here's the unsettling question. Why does nobody want to talk about what's underneath? Let's start with what we actually know, not what we've been told. In the book of Genesis, chapter 6, there's a passage so uncomfortable that entire religious traditions have spent centuries trying to explain it away. The sons of God saw that the daughters of humans were beautiful, and they married any of them they chose. Sons of God, descending, choosing, taking, and from that union came the Nephilim, beings described as giants, as mighty ones, as men of renown. The Hebrew word Nephilim comes from the root Nephal, to fall, the fallen one. Now pause right there because most Sunday school lessons skip over Genesis 6 like it's a footnote. It's not a footnote, it's a detonation buried in the middle of the oldest book of the Western world. And what it's describing, divine beings crossing a forbidden boundary, interbreeding with humanity, producing a hybrid race of giants that dominated the ancient earth. That is not a metaphor. The text doesn't present it as a metaphor. The ancient readers didn't read it as a metaphor. They read it as history. And here's where it gets interesting, because if you walk away from Genesis 6 and walk towards the banks of the Euphrates River 4,000 years ago, maybe 5, you find the Sumerians, the oldest civilizations we know of. And the Sumerians had a name for their gods. They called them the Anunnaki. And the Anunnaki, according to Sumerian tablets, descended from the heavens. They came down. They ruled over humanity. They demanded worship, tribute, labor, and sacrifice. The Sumerian word for human being, Lu, literally means servant. The gods came, humanity served. That was the arrangement. Does that sound familiar? Because looking at Genesis 6 and looking at the Sumerian tablets, the spot seems almost the same structure, divine beings, descent, domination, hybrid offsprings, a mankind that was created or shaped to serve. So why were these two traditions, Hebrew and Sumerian, treated like they exist in completely separate universes? They don't. Geographically, historically, culturally, they are neighbors. They overlap. And yet, when scholars start noticing the overlap, there's this institutional reflex to separate them, to sanitize them, to explain away the similarities as mere coincidence or the cultural borrowing in one benign direction only. What if the borrowing goes deeper than that? What if they are both describing the same event? Now let's bring in the book of Enoch, because this is where it gets even more settling. The book of Enoch is one of the most important texts you've never been taught in church. It was considered scripture by the earliest Jewish community. It's quoted directly in the New Testament. Jude verse 14 and 15 cites Enoch by name, and yet it was removed, suppressed, kept out of the canonical Bible. You have to ask yourself why. You have to ask what was in it that made certain councils of men decide it was too dangerous to include. What in it is this? A detailed account of 200 watchers, a specific class of divine being who made a pact with one another on the summit of Mount Hermon. They swore an oath. They would descend, they would take human wives, and they would teach humanity things that were forbidden, specifically forbidden. The leader was called Samyezer, and under him the 200 descended. And then the book of Enoch lists what they taught: metrology, weaponry, sorcery, astrology, the cutting of roots, enchantments, the art of war, cosmetics, and here's the one that stops me cold every time: they taught the reading of omens and interpretation of dreams. In other words, they taught humanity the tools of civilization, the very things we call the foundation of culture. Think about that for a second, because we are told that civilizations emerge gradually, organically through thousands of years of slow human development. But the ancient world's own testimony says otherwise. They say it was given to them, handed down by beings who came from above. And now, I have to ask you something because I think it matters. If these watchers, the fallen ones, descended and taught humanity and bred hybrid offsprings and were then judged and imprisoned by God, where did they go in the memory of the culture they dominated? Did they just disappear? Did the people who built temples for them, who offered them blood, who called them by name for thousands of years, did they simply forget? Or did they rename them? Look at the god Azazel. The book of Enoch names him specifically. He taught humanity how to make swords and shields. He taught women the act of deception, the decoration of the eyes, the adorning of the body. God's response to Azazel is recorded in 1 Enoch 10 verse 4. Bind Azazel's hand and foot and cast him into the darkness. He is bound beneath the desert, beneath a place called Dudael, buried in stone, buried in rock. Now, look at the scapegoat ritual in Leviticus 16, one of the most ancient rituals in the Hebrew Bible. 2 goats are selected. One is sacrificed to God. The other, and this is the part that should unsettle you, the other is sent into the wilderness, carrying the sins of the people. And in Leviticus 16 verse 8, it says, the second goat is sent to Azazel. Azazel, named directly in the Torah, a being distinct from God, a being in the wilderness, a being to whom sin is literally sent. Scholars call it a ritual. They call it symbolic. But what if it's a record? What if the Hebrews were preserving the memory, even in their most sacred liturgy, of a being who was real, who was known, who was banished but not forgotten? Now across the desert, move into Egypt. The Egyptians had a god named Set. Chaos, destruction, the desert, associated with storms, with red sands, with foreigners and outsiders. Set murdered his own brother Osiris, tore him apart and scattered the pieces across the earth. Set is ancient, older than a pyramid text, and Set's domain is specifically the Red Desert, the place of isolation, the place of the banished. Is that the same desert where Azazel is buried? I'm not claiming certainty. I'm claiming the question deserves to be asked out loud, because nobody seems to know what to ask. Now, move to Mesopotamia, to Babylon, to the god Negao, lord of the underworld, ruler of the dead, associated with plague and war and catastrophe. Or look at Enlil, the great sky god who decided to destroy humanity with a flood, who sat in his divine assembly and passed judgment on the human race. Sound familiar? Because in Genesis, that judgment comes from God, but in the Sumerian accounts, it comes from a council, a pantheon, a group of divine beings who debated and disagreed about whether humanity should survive. A divine council, multiple divine beings debating over the fate of humanity. And Psalm 82, which is sitting right there in the middle of your Bible, opens with this: God stands in the divine assembly. He renders judgment amongst the gods, plural, in a divine assembly. This is not a metaphor inserted by accident. The Hebrew worldview at its oldest layer accommodated the existence of multiple divine beings, a hierarchy, a council, and within that council, rebellion was possible. Rebellion happened. Now, here's the turning point, the moment where this entire investigation pivots on its axis and the stakes triple, because there is one name that appears across cultures with such disturbing consistency that when you finally see it, you can't unsee it. Baal. In Canaan, Baal is the storm god, the sky god, the one who rides the clouds. He is the supreme deity of the Canaanite world. He has temples, he has priests, he has a consort named Asherah and a daughter named Amat, the goddess of war. Baal demands sacrifice, including, according to some records, the sacrifice of children, the Tophet, the furnace where the youngest and most innocent were burned. The Hebrew prophets do not treat Baal as a fiction. They treat him as a real, active power. Elijah doesn't stand on Mount Carmel and argue that Baal doesn't exist. He argues that Baal is inferior to God. That's a fundamentally different claim, and it suggests that the Hebrew understanding was never that. The Hebrew understanding was that the gods of the nation were real and dangerous and in rebellion. Deuteronomy 32, 8-9. Listen to this carefully, because the older manuscripts say something the later text tried to soften. When the Most High gave the nations their inheritance, when he separated the sons of men, he fixed the borders of the people according to the numbers of the sons of God. The nations were divided and assigned to other divine beings. The people of the earth were passed out like territories like colonies. And verse 9 says, but the Lord's portion is his people. So, the ancient Hebrew cosmology describes a world where the nations were given to or assigned to other supernatural powers. Powers who then ruled them. Powers who then demanded to be worshipped. Powers who, from the perspective of biblical theology, were not authorized to hold that position. They took it. They corrupted it. They bent the knees of humanity towards themselves. That's a political framework. That's a political structure. And when you hold that framework up against the ancient world's religious history, everything clicks into place with terrifying precision. In Egypt, the gods demanded to be worshipped as supreme rulers. The pharaoh was the son of Ra, the embodied divine. The entire civilization was built around the service of these beings. In Mesopotamia, the Anunnaki held divine authority over the land and its people. The king was their representative. The Zuggurat was the point of contact between the divine realm and the human world. The gods descended and humans obeyed. Canaan, Baal and his council covered the spiritual landscape. The high places, the Bamots, were everywhere, on every hill, under every green tree. The presence of the divine was local, territorial, inescapable. Greece, Zeus and his Olympians held dominion over the nations and over fate itself. The gods interfered, they meddled, they took sides in the wars, they seduced humans, they fathered hybrid children, the demigods, the heroes, the giants who shaped the course of history. Do you see what I'm saying? Every major ancient civilization separately, independently, with their own languages and traditions and geographies produced the same fundamental story. Divine beings came from above. They ruled. They demanded worship and sacrifice. They produced hybrid offsprings. They were involved in catastrophic conflicts with one another. And their dealings with humanity were defined by a specific transaction, service and sacrifice in exchange for order, fertility, and protection. That is not a coincidence. That is a pattern. And patterns in the ancient world, when they appear with this much consistency, are usually memories. Stay with me because we're not done yet, and what comes next is the part that breaks the whole framework open. If you've made it this far, I need you to understand something, because the next piece of this puzzle, it changes the question entirely. It doesn't just ask who the fallen angels were. It asks what they were doing and whether they are still doing it. In the book of Daniel, there's an angel, a messenger from God, who tells Daniel something stunning. He says he was delayed for 21 days because the prince of Persia withstood him. Not the human king of Persia, the prince, the spiritual power behind Persia, the divine being in rebellion who held authority over that nation and physically resisted a messenger of God for 3 weeks. And then the angel says something even more unsettling. He says that after he leaves Daniel, he will return to fight the prince of Persia again. And then the prince of Greece will come. Princes, spiritual princes, over nations in active conflict with one another and with the emissaries of God, not in some distant past, in Daniel's present moment, in the middle of human history. This is not mythology. This is described as real-time spiritual geopolitics. And what it reveals is that the framework from Deuteronomy 32, the nations divided among divine power, was not a relic of the past. It was an ongoing, active, contexted reality, which means the gods of Greece were not just stories. The princes of Persia were not just symbols. They were the powers, the same powers who descended on Hermon, the same powers who built temples and demanded worship, the same powers who had been given or had seized authority over the nations of men. And here's the question that I find even more disturbing. If those powers were real enough to delay an angel, if they were real enough that Daniel was told their names and their territories, if they were real enough that God's own messenger needed reinforcement from the archangel Michael to push through their resistance, then what happened to them? Because they aren't gone. The Bible doesn't say they were destroyed. The book of Enoch says some were imprisoned beneath the earth, bound in chains of darkness, awaiting final judgment. But not all of them. Some are still moving, still operating. Psalm 82 ends with God pronouncing judgment on the divine council. You will die like humans. You will fall like any prince. But the judgment is future. It hasn't happened yet. So, where are they now? This is the part where I have to sit with the uncertainty, because I genuinely don't know. And I think anybody who claims to know with complete confidence is telling you something. But here's what I can say with conviction. The ancient world did not invent these gods from nothing. Human beings across every continent and culture developed religious systems with remarkable spiritual similarities. Divine beings who descended, who mated with humans, who created hybrid offsprings, who demanded worship through blood, who controlled the force of nature and the fate of nations. And the oldest text of Hebrew Bible, not the Sinai Sunday School version, but the raw, uncomfortable, unedited text, describes a cosmology that includes exactly those beings, real, named, active, and in rebellion. The fallen angels and the old gods, the watchers and the Anunnaki, the sons of God and the princes of the nations. What if they are not two different categories? What if they are the same story told by people who lived under them? And now, because this is where the whole case collapses into something bearable. The prophets knew, the apostle knew. Paul writes in Ephesians 6 verse 12, and this is not a metaphor. This is a man who wrote half the New Testament. This is one of the most important theological documents in human history. We do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this age, against spiritual hosts of wickedness in the heavenly places. Principalities, powers, rulers, hosts in the highest places. Present tense, active tense, happening now. And in Jude 1:6, the angels who do not keep their proper domain, but left their own abode, he has reserved in everlasting chain under darkness for the judgment of the great day. Left their proper domain, that's the watchers. That's the descent from heaven. And Jude is writing this in the 1st century. He's not writing mythology, he's writing theology. He's telling the early church that this is real, that it happened, and that the judgment is still coming. So here's the fruit of what we are looking at. There was a divine council. There was a rebellion. Some of the rebelling power were imprisoned immediately. Some were not. The nations of the earth were divided under this power, either as punishment or as assessment or as something in between. Scholars debate it, and these powers ruled. They ruled as gods. They built empires around their worship. They extracted sacrifice. They shaped civilization. And the memory of their rule is preserved not just in mythology, it is preserved in the oldest layer of scriptures itself. And then comes the moment, that is, if you believe the biblical narrative, the entire point of history, the intervention, God doesn't respond to the rebellion of the divine court with a memo. He doesn't respond with a press release. He calls one man, Abraham, out of Ur of the Chaldees, Ur, the Sumerian city, the heartland of Anunnaki worship. He pulls one man out of the very civilization that was most under the influence of these powers, and he begins through this one man and his descendants to reclaim the nations. That is an extraordinary claim, and I've thought about it because on the surface it sounds like just another origin story for a tribal religion, but when you understand the cosmological framework underneath it, when you read it against the backdrop of Deuteronomy 32, of Psalm 82, of Daniel's princes, of the book of Enoch, it reads differently. It reads like a counter-insurgency, like a long, slow, painful operation to take back territory that had been seized by rebellious power. Every time Israel falls into worshipping Baal, they are not just making a cultural mistake, they are, within their own theological framework, surrendering to the prince of that territory. Every time they sacrifice at the high places, they are feeding the power that God is trying to dismantle. And every time the prophets scream, Elijah on camel, Jeremiah in the temple courts, Isaiah against the nations, they are not just advocating for monotheism in the abstract. They are fighting a war that had been going on since the descent on Haman, a war over who owned the nations, a war over who humanity would serve. And then, at the moment described in the gospel, God doesn't send another prophet, he doesn't send another angel, he comes himself. And the first thing that happens, the very first public act after the baptism of Jesus, is that he goes into the wilderness, into the desert, into the domain of the one who is called the ruler of this world, the prince of the power of the air, and he is tested, tempted, and offered. This is the part that strikes me every time. Offered all the kingdoms of the world. Luke 4:6, the adversary says, all this authority I will give you, and their glory, for this has been delivered to me, and I will give it to whomsoever I wish. Deliver to me. That's a claim of legitimate possession, and Jesus does not dispute it. He doesn't say, we don't actually have that. He refuses the offer, but he doesn't deny the reality of the power, because The power is real. The authority over the nation, taken, seized, corrupted from the divine assignment, is real. And the entire mission within the biblical narrative is to undo it, to reclaim it, to restore the nation to their proper king. Now, I want you to feel the full weight of this because this is where everything converges. The ancient gods, the Anunnaki of Sumer, the Elohim of Canaan, the Neturu of Egypt, the Titans of Greece, were not the inventions of primitive minds trying to explain lightning and harvest. They were the memories of a real spiritual hierarchy that had gone wrong, a council that rebelled, power that descended, rulers who set themselves up as God over the nations and demanded what only God was owed. And the story of the biblical history, from Genesis to Revelation, is the story of what happens when the rightful king moves back to take his throne. The nations that were divided at Babel, they will be reunited. Revelation 21 and 22 describes the king of the earth bringing their glory into the new Jerusalem. The nations, the same nations that were parceled out under rebellious power, are restored, healed, brought home. The giants who terrorized the ancient world, gone, swept away in flood and in war and divine judgment. The hybrid powers are dismantled. The princes who resisted Daniel's angel, they face the same judgment declared in Psalm 82. You will die like men. And Revelation 12 describes the final conflict, the accuser thrown down, the dragon and his angels marching war and losing, cast out of the heavenly places once and for all. It's all connected, every piece, from Hammon to Babylon, to Canaan, to Greece, to Rome, to the empty tube, to the final throne. And I keep coming back to this. What does it mean that humanity has spent most of its existence worshiping beings who were themselves in rebellion? What does it mean that the rebellious impulse, the deep, universal, unkillable human need to reach towards the divine, was captured, redirected, fed into systems that served power that were not what they claimed to be? Because if the fallen angels became the old gods, then the history of religion is not primarily a story of human invention, it's a story of human captivity. And the whole arc of the biblical narrative is the story of rescue. That should do something to you, whether you believe it literally or whether you hold it at arm's length as myth. The architecture of it should arrest your attention because it's the most ambitious story ever told. It is not a story about a tribe's local deity. It is a story about the ownership of the cosmos, about who holds authority over the nations, about whether the beings who claim to be gods actually were, or whether they were usurps who would one day face the one who sat above the cycle of the earth before any of them drew breath. And the haunting thing, the thing I genuinely cannot shake, is that the culture who lived closest to these powers, who built the most elaborate worship systems around them, who gave them the most and suffered the most under them, these cultures also produced some of the most profound records of their nature. The Sumerians knew these beings came from outside. The Egyptians knew that gods had history of conflict and rebellion and imprisonment. The Greek knew the Titans had been overthrown and chained. Everyone who was close to the fire knew the fire was dangerous. Only the modern world decided these were just stories. And maybe that's the most dangerous conclusion of all. Not that the fallen angels became the old gods, but that we stopped believing either existed. And in doing so, stopped asking who or what had been shaping the structure of the world ever since. The watch has descended, the gods ruled, the nations forgot, the prophets screamed in the dark, and somewhere in the records, in the stone tablets of Nineveh, in the cuneiform of Sumer, in the temple walls of Luxor, in the suppressed pages of Enoch, the names are still there, waiting, patient, as if they know that eventually someone will read them again and ask the question that changes everything. Were they ever really gone?